In the name of our Creator, our Redeemer, and our Sanctifier, Amen. Have a seat. Good morning. It's hard to say anything new about today's gospel reading. So I'm just going to say something old instead and read you a piece from the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s Drum Major Instinct sermon. I know a man. He was born in an obscure village, the child of a poor peasant woman, and then he grew up in still another obscure village where he worked as a carpenter until he was 30 years old. Then for 3 years, he just got on his feet, and he was an itinerant preacher, and he went about doing some things. He didn't have much. He never wrote a book. He never held an office. He never had a family. He never owned a house. He never went to college. He never visited a big city. He never went 200 miles from where he was born. He did none of the usual things that the world would associate with greatness. He had no credentials but himself. He was only 33 when the tide of public opinion turned against him. They called him a rabble-rouser. They called him a troublemaker. They said he was an agitator. He practiced civil disobedience. He broke injunctions. And so he was turned over to his enemies and went through the mockery of a trial. And the irony of it all is that his friends turned him over to his enemies. One of his closest friends denied him. Another of his friends turned him over, and while he was dying, the people who killed him gambled for his clothing, the only possession that he had in the world. When he was dead, he was buried in a borrowed tomb through the pity of a friend. Dr. King is talking here about the same young backwoods agitator who asks us in today's gospel and throughout our lives, what belongs to Caesar and what belongs to God? If we really take Jesus as our teacher, it all belongs to God. Shelley and I were talking about this gospel reading on Wednesday, and she said, nothing belongs to Caesar. He stole it all, which is true. Not just in a metaphysical sense, but in a material sense. The Roman Empire, like every empire, like the American Empire, was built on the violence of mass theft of land, labor, bodies, and natural resources. It all rightfully belongs to God, and it must be taken back, snatched out of the emperor's bloody hands, and restored to God's dream for abundant life and thriving for all. Which sounds very beautiful and compelling until we realize that it's us who have to take it back. How do we do that? In adult ed for the past few weeks, some of you have been doing a Bible study comparing the last week of Jesus' life and the last year of Martin Luther King Jr.'s life. And this is in preparation for November 6th. When the Reverend Dr. William Barber will hold a mass meeting here in Seattle for the new Poor People's Campaign. The original Poor People's Campaign of 1968 was the project Martin Luther King Jr. was working on at the time of his assassination. His impetus for this work began on a visit to Marks, Mississippi, when confronted with 4 young children sharing one apple for lunch. He publicly broke down and wept in the street. And he said to his staff, "I don't think people know this is going on in America," which might be a way of saying, I didn't know this was going on in America. So at the end, King was working to bring poor people together across racial lines in a massive occupation of the National Mall in Washington, D.C., and they erected there an enormous shanty town called Resurrection City. They were instructed to agitate and lobby their representatives until their demands for decent housing, healthcare, education, nutrition, and an end to the Vietnam War were met. The plan was carried out after King's assassination, but within 6 weeks, the movement was floundering in collective grief and loss for leadership. That was 50 years ago. At that time, most Americans were enjoying their highest standard of living. Today, about half of Americans are living in poverty. Conditions of daily life are much worse for most people than when King organized. The repression is escalating. These are hard times to build a movement. These are times when we have to look back to King's era, and when those models fail, perhaps look back even further to the scriptures. Jesus' execution, as King reminds us, was carried out by people so poor they gambled with each other over who would get the dead homeless man's clothing. Pilate gave the orders, the soldiers obeyed, and they got their scraps in reward. Who belongs to Caesar? Who belongs to God? I've worked on the New Poor People's Campaign for about 10 years, and there are as many different tasks to take up in this movement as there are people willing to work. So the role that I've taken up over the past few years is counter-recruiting the poor foot soldiers of Caesar. Increasingly, our work at Chaplains on the Harbor, a mission station of this diocese, has been to engage homeless and incarcerated white millennials who are a target demographic for recruitment into white power street and prison gangs, and to win them into a movement for the liberation and dignity of all people. It's slow, hard, and sometimes dangerous work, but it's also a lot more effective and doable than most people expect. Because it's not all that difficult to do a better job than Caesar at showing love to poor people. And there are many ways this counter-recruitment from Caesar is replicated across the New Poor People's Campaign. Poor veterans organizing to end the wars against poor people abroad. Poor Appalachians organizing survival projects so their neighbors don't have to rely on economic support from white supremacist groups. Bob Zellner, a movement elder who worked on the original Poor People's Campaign and slept over Todd and Betsy Volker's house the last time he was in town, had a grandfather and a father in the Ku Klux Klan, and as a teenager he renounced his family tradition and was nearly murdered for it when he was 16 years old at his first demonstration. And he hasn't stopped working on counter-recruitment ever since. The work looks different across different contexts, but I think counter-recruitment from Caesar's rule is both at the heart of the Poor People's Campaign and at the heart of the gospel. When something or someone belongs to Caesar, they are owned. When something or someone belongs to God, they are liberated. If we truly seek to render unto God what is God's, we seek liberation from all the systems keeping Caesar on the throne and God strung up and bleeding out on a cross at the edge of town. We can choose to be Pilate, bureaucratic functionaries who get others to do our dirty work for us, or we can be like the Pharisees in God's reading, in today's reading, looking to set traps because we consider ourselves righteous already and cannot abide by somebody poorer, scrappier, and weirder than us coming up with better ideas and actions. Or we can be the desperate and numb soldiers casting lots over a dead man's clothes. Or we can choose discipleship, the disciplined, collective effort, the movement to get all of us free. All of us or none of us.